August 15, 1945. The war was over. In a small prisoner of war camp outside Florence, Arizona, 43 Japanese women sat in stunned silence as Captain Dorothy Walsh delivered news that shattered their entire world. The Emperor had surrendered. Japan had lost. For these women, members of the Imperial Japanese Army's Women's Auxiliary Corps, the announcement meant more than military defeat. It meant the collapse of everything they had been taught to believe, everything they had sacrificed for, everything that had given their suffering meaning. But what happened next would confuse them even more than the surrender itself. Sergeant William Brooks, the camp's mess hall supervisor, had decided that this historic moment called for something special. He ordered his kitchen staff to prepare what he considered the most American meal possible: hot dogs, potato chips, and ice-cold Coca-Cola. When the metal trays were placed before the Japanese prisoners, 24-year-old Keiko Tanaka stared at the strange cylindrical meat in a split bun with complete bewilderment. Corporal Thomas Fletcher, a guard from Texas, noticed her confusion and tried to help. "It's a hot dog," he said slowly, gesturing at the food. "Hot dog. You eat it like this." He demonstrated by picking one up and taking a bite. Keiko's eyes widened in horror. She turned to her friend Yuki Nakamura and whispered urgently in Japanese, "They are feeding us dogs. The Americans are making us eat dogs." Yuki, a 21-year-old nurse who had been captured in the Philippines, looked equally disturbed. "Why would they call it hot if it is not steaming?" she whispered back. "And why would anyone eat a dog?" The confusion spread through the group like wildfire. Some women pushed their trays away, certain this was some kind of cruel joke or punishment. Others simply stared, trying to reconcile the pleasant smell coming from the food with the disturbing name. 27-year-old Harumi Sato, the oldest of the group and a former administrative clerk, studied the hot dog with the analytical mind that had made her valuable to the Imperial Army. This did not look like any dog she had ever seen. The texture was wrong, the size was wrong, but the name was clear. The American had said, "dog." She picked up the strange food cautiously, examining it from every angle, while other prisoners watched her with a mixture of curiosity and disgust. Captain Walsh observed the scene from across the mess hall, puzzled by their reaction to what she considered a simple, friendly meal. She had no idea that this moment, this confusion over something as ordinary as a hot dog, would become the beginning of an extraordinary transformation. Before we discover how these women came to understand not just American food, but America itself, tell us where you are watching from in the comments below. The story begins 9 months earlier, in November 1944, when the first group of Japanese women, prisoners, arrived at Camp Florence under heavy guard. Unlike the thousands of male Japanese POWs held across America, these women represented something unprecedented. They were captured members of the Imperial Japanese Army's Women's Auxiliary Corps, taken prisoner during the Allied advance through the Pacific Islands. The War Department had struggled with where to house them, finally settling on a small, hastily modified section of the Arizona camp, separated from the male prisoners by high fences and constant supervision. Keiko Tanaka had been captured on Saipan, where she had served as a communications specialist for the Imperial Army. She had burned her codebooks and destroyed her equipment before the Americans overran her position, expecting to die in the final defense. Instead, she found herself bound and placed on a transport ship, heading toward an enemy country she had been taught to hate and fear. During the long journey across the Pacific, she clutched a small silk pouch containing a photograph of her family in Yokohama and a lock of her younger sister's hair. These were the only possessions she had left from her former life. Yuki Nakamura had served as a nurse on Tinian, caring for wounded Japanese soldiers in underground hospital caves. She had been found unconscious from dehydration after hiding for 3 days following the island's fall. When she woke in an American field hospital, her first words were a request to be allowed to die with honor. The American doctors had looked at her with confusion and pity. emotion she found more disturbing than hatred would have been. She had expected enemies, not caregivers. Harumi Sato's capture had been different. As an administrative clerk at a forward command post in the Marshall Islands, she had been seized when Marines stormed the headquarters building. She had tried to destroy documents until the very last moment, her hands covered in ink and paper cuts when the Americans finally pulled her away from the burning files. At 27, she was older than most of her fellow prisoners and had served the Empire longer. Her dedication ran deeper, her belief in Japanese superiority more firmly rooted. When the transport truck finally stopped at Camp Florence, the women stepped down onto Arizona soil with military precision despite their exhaustion. Captain Dorothy Walsh, recently assigned to command this unprecedented facility, watched them form ranks without being ordered. They wore remnants of their auxiliary uniforms, some still bearing the insignia they refused to remove. Their faces showed no emotion, but Walsh noticed how their eyes darted around, taking in every detail of their surroundings. These were not defeated soldiers. These were warriors who had been denied the death they had expected, and now faced something far more uncertain than battle. The first weeks at Camp Florence were marked by an almost complete absence of communication between the Japanese women and their American captors. The prisoners moved through their daily routines like ghosts, responding to orders through action but never speech. They woke at dawn, maintained their sleeping quarters with obsessive precision, and ate their meals in total silence. Captain Walsh had dealt with difficult prisoners before, but nothing had prepared her for this wall of disciplined refusal to engage. Corporal Thomas Fletcher, assigned to guard duty in the women's section, found the silence unnerving. Back home in Texas, he had grown up in a household full of noise and conversation. His mother and 3 sisters never stopped talking, and he had enlisted partly to escape the constant chatter. Now, ironically, he found himself desperate for any sound from these foreign women who moved through the compound like silent shadows. He tried simple greetings in the mornings. Good morning, nice day, sleep well. The women would bow slightly, a gesture so ingrained in their culture they could not suppress it, but they never spoke. The language barrier was formidable, but Captain Walsh suspected it went deeper than mere inability to communicate. These women had been taught that capture meant dishonor worse than death. By surviving when they should have perished, they had already violated everything their culture had demanded of them. Speaking to their captors, acknowledging them as human beings rather than faceless enemies, would be yet another betrayal of the empire they had served. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, the camp's administrative officer and one of the few Asian Americans in the facility, had tried approaching the prisoners in hopes that seeing another Asian face might ease their fear. Instead, the women had reacted with even greater hostility, viewing her as a traitor to her race. Mealtimes presented the greatest challenge. The camp kitchen, accustomed to feeding American soldiers and male POWs who ate with enthusiasm, was baffled by the Japanese women's approach to food. They ate only enough to survive, taking small portions and consuming them with mechanical efficiency. Sergeant Brooks worried they were starving themselves deliberately. He had heard stories of Japanese soldiers committing suicide rather than face the shame of capture, and he feared these women might be slowly doing the same through self-imposed starvation. He began preparing smaller portions of plainer food, thinking perhaps American cooking was too foreign for their palates. Keiko sat at the long mess hall table, forcing herself to swallow the unfamiliar food despite her stomach's protests. Everything tasted wrong. The bread was too soft, the meat too heavily seasoned, the vegetables cooked until they lost all texture. But more disturbing than the taste was the abundance. Even as prisoners, they were being fed more than many civilians in Japan had seen in years. This generosity felt like mockery, a way of demonstrating American superiority through excess. She caught Yuki's eye across the table and saw her own. Confusion reflected there. They had been taught that Americans were cruel, barbaric, inferior. Yet here they were, being treated with a gentleness that made no sense within the framework of everything they believed. December brought cooler weather to Arizona, though nothing like the winters Keiko remembered from Yokohama. One afternoon, Corporal Fletcher appeared in the women's compound carrying a large cardboard box. He had been thinking about the prisoners constantly, troubled by their obvious misery. His younger sister back home was about the same age as many of these women, and he could not shake the image of her being held in some foreign camp, silent and afraid. He had decided to do something, even if it violated the unspoken rule of maintaining distance between guards and prisoners. Inside the box were items from the camp commissary that he had purchased with his own money: chocolate bars, chewing gum, playing cards, and at the bottom, carefully wrapped in paper, a dozen hot dogs he had convinced Sergeant Brooks to prepare specially. Fletcher had reasoned that if the women would not eat substantial meals, perhaps familiar finger foods might be more appealing. Of course, hot dogs were not familiar to them at all, but he did not know that. He approached the group of women sitting in the recreation yard and set the box down on a bench. "I thought you might like some snacks," he said, his Texas drawl slow and careful. "Help yourselves." He gestured at the box and stepped back, not wanting to seem threatening. The women stared at him with suspicious eyes. Harumi stood first, her role as the eldest making her the unofficial leader. She approached the box cautiously, as if it might contain weapons. When she looked inside and saw candy bars and gum, her expression shifted from suspicion to confusion. Why would their captor give them gifts? She picked up one of the wrapped hot dogs, still warm, from the kitchen. The smell was strange but not unpleasant. Fletcher, seeing her interest, tried to explain. "That is a hot dog," he said, emphasizing each word. "Very American, very popular. Everyone in America eats hot dogs." He mimed, taking a bite, and smiled encouragingly. Harumi unwrapped the paper slowly, revealing the frankfurter nestled in its bun. She studied it with the same analytical intensity she had once applied to military documents. The bread was soft, almost cake-like. The sausage inside was reddish-brown and glistened with moisture. It smelled of smoke and spices she could not identify. "Hot dog," Fletcher repeated, pointing at the food. "Dog, you understand?" Harumi's English was limited, but she understood that word. Dog, inu. Her eyes widened slightly. She turned to the other women and spoke in rapid Japanese. "He says this is dog meat. The Americans eat dogs." A wave of disgust rippled through the group. Yuki covered her mouth with her hand. Michiko Yamada, a young radio operator, looked like she might be sick, even in the midst of war. Even facing starvation, the idea of eating dog meat seemed barbaric to them. Yet the smell was undeniably appealing. Keiko stepped forward and took one of the wrapped hot dogs from the box. "If this is what Americans eat," she said quietly in Japanese, "perhaps we should understand our enemy better." She unwrapped it completely, and with everyone watching, took a small, hesitant bite. The flavor that filled Keiko's mouth was unlike anything she had expected. Salty, smoky, with a slight sweetness from the bun. The texture was soft and yielding, nothing like the dried fish and rice that had been staples of her diet back home. She chewed slowly, aware that every woman in the compound was watching her reaction. Her face remained neutral, giving nothing away. But inside she was wrestling with a disturbing realization. This food, made by her enemies, tasted good. More than good, it tasted comforting, in a way that made her feel guilty and confused. Yuki was the next to try. As a nurse, she had learned to be practical about survival. If this food could give them strength, then their personal feelings about it were irrelevant. She took a bite and her eyes widened slightly. "It is not dog," she whispered to Keiko in Japanese. "I have treated enough wounds to know what different meats smell like. This is pork, perhaps, or beef." The revelation spread through the group quickly. The Americans had not been trying to feed them dog meat. They simply called this food by a name that made no sense. relief mixed with embarrassment. They had misunderstood something so basic. Over the following weeks, hot dogs became a strange fixture in their prison life. Sergeant Brooks, noticing that the women had finally eaten something with apparent enjoyment, began including them in meals more frequently. Each time, Corporal Fletcher would appear and carefully pronounce the name. Hot dog. The women would repeat it, their Japanese accents turning the words into something that sounded like hot-dogu. The phrase became a kind of joke among them, something that bridged the gap between their world and this strange American reality. But hot dogs were just the beginning of their culinary education. Fletcher took it upon himself to teach them English through food, bringing items from the commissary and naming them slowly. Hamburger, French fries, apple pie, ice cream. Each word was a small victory, a crack in the wall of silence that had separated captors from captives. The women began to respond, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Michiko discovered she had a talent for pronunciation. Reiko Fujiwara, who had studied some English before the war, became an informal translator for the others. Private Daniel Costa, a Portuguese-American from California, joined Fletcher's informal teaching sessions. His own family had faced discrimination during the war years, viewed with suspicion because of their foreign background. He understood what it meant to be caught between two worlds, to have your loyalty questioned because of your heritage. He brought his mother's homemade cookies to share, explaining in simple English how she made them. The women listened with an intensity that had nothing to do with recipes and everything to do with the fundamental human need for connection. As winter turned to spring in 1945, the mess hall began to sound different. Instead of oppressive silence, there were hesitant conversations in broken English. Please pass salt. Thank you. This is good. Simple phrases that represented extraordinary progress. The women still maintained their dignity and their distance, but the absolute wall of refusal had begun to crumble, one hot dog at a time. Spring of 1945 brought cherry blossoms to parts of America, but in the Arizona desert, it brought only dust and devastating news from the Pacific. The women gathered around the radio in the recreation hall as Captain Walsh translated news reports about the Allied advance toward Japan. Each island name was a dagger to their hearts. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, places that had been defended with fanatical desperation, where thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians had chosen death over surrender. The women knew that among those numbers were likely people they loved. Keiko had written 17 letters to her family in Yokohama through the International Red Cross. She had received no replies. Each week, she would ask Lieutenant Chen if any mail had arrived, and each week the answer was the same gentle shake of the head. The silence was worse than bad news. Bad news would at least be certain. This not knowing created a void that her imagination filled with increasingly dark scenarios. Were her parents alive? Her younger sister Emiko? The photographic studio her father had owned? Or had American bombs reduced everything to ash and memory? Yuki faced similar torment. Her family lived in Tokyo, and the reports of firebombing raids on the capital were specific and horrifying. Entire neighborhoods consumed by flames. Tens of thousands killed in single nights. She had nightmares about her mother and father trapped in their small wooden house, unable to escape the inferno. During the day, she maintained her composure, but Harumi had heard her crying softly in her bunk after lights out, whispering the names of her family members like a prayer or a farewell. The American guards were not immune to similar fears. Corporal Fletcher's brother was serving with the Marines somewhere in the Pacific. He had not received a letter from home in 6 weeks, and the waiting gnawed at him. Private Costa's cousin had been killed at Normandy the previous year, and his mother's grief-stricken letters arrived irregularly, each one a reminder of how war destroyed families on both sides of every conflict. One afternoon in late April, Fletcher found Keiko sitting alone in the compound yard, staring at a letter she had written, but would likely never be able to send. He recognized the posture of someone carrying unbearable worry. "Your family?" he asked simply, gesturing at the letter. Keiko looked up, surprised that he would speak to her about something so personal. She nodded slowly. "Yokohama," she said, one of the few Japanese words he had learned. "Mother, father, sister." Her English was improving, but emotion made the words difficult. Fletcher sat down on the bench nearby, maintaining a respectful distance. "My brother," he said, pulling out his own worn letter from his pocket. "Marines, Pacific. No word for long time." He struggled to simplify his English so she would understand. They sat in silence for a moment, two people on opposite sides of a war, united by the universal experience of loving someone who might already be dead. Keiko spoke carefully in English. "War is difficult for families, all families." Fletcher nodded. "Yeah, all families." It was not a profound conversation, but it was honest, and in that honesty, something shifted between them. August 15th, 1945. The day began like any other at Camp Florence, with the women going through their morning routines. But by noon, an unusual tension had gripped the entire facility. American guards moved with urgent purpose, whispering to each other in clusters. Captain Walsh had been called to an emergency meeting with camp leadership. Something significant was happening, and the Japanese women could feel it in the air like an approaching storm. When the announcement finally came, it shattered their world more completely than any bomb ever could. Captain Walsh gathered all 43 women in the main hall. Her face was serious, but not unkind. Lieutenant Chen stood beside her, ready to help translate the words that would change everything. "Ladies," Walsh began, her voice steady and clear, "I have received word from Washington. The Emperor of Japan has announced Japan's surrender. The war is over." The words hung in the air for a moment before their meaning fully registered. Then chaos erupted, not loudly, but with devastating emotional force. Harumi's legs gave out and she collapsed to her knees, her hand clutching at her chest as if she had been physically struck. Yuki began shaking her head violently, repeating "no, no, no" in Japanese, refusing to accept what she had just heard. Michiko stood frozen, her face drained of all color, tears streaming down her cheeks without her seeming to notice. Keiko felt the room spin around her. The Emperor had surrendered. The divine being who could not be wrong had admitted defeat. Everything they had believed, every sacrifice they had made, every friend who had died, all of it had been for a cause that had now officially failed. Reiko Fujiwara, the translator who had maintained the strongest facade of composure throughout their captivity, suddenly screamed. It was a raw, primal sound of anguish that made even the battle-hardened American guards step back in shock. She screamed, in Japanese words that needed no translation. "We were supposed to die. We should have died with honor. Now we are nothing." Other women took up the cry, not in anger at their captors, but in grief at the loss of everything that had defined their existence. Captain Walsh had prepared for many possible reactions, but not this complete psychological collapse. These were not women celebrating the end of war. These were women mourning the death of their entire worldview. She made a quick decision and ordered the guards to give them space and privacy. "Let them grieve," she told Fletcher and Costa. "They have just lost everything they believed in." The American personnel withdrew to the perimeter of the hall, while the Japanese women clung to each other and wept. For 3 hours, the women remained in the hall, processing their devastation in their own language and their own way. Some sat in stunned silence. Others talked rapidly, trying to make sense of the impossible. Keiko found herself thinking about the hot dogs, the English lessons, the small kindnesses from guards who should have been monsters. Had the Americans known all along that Japan would lose? Had they been kind because they pitied prisoners serving a doomed cause? The days following the surrender announcement passed in a fog of unreality. The women moved through their routines mechanically, but everything felt hollow and purposeless. Captain Walsh had expected relief, perhaps even celebration, but instead she witnessed something closer to mass depression. The women who had slowly begun to engage with their captors now retreated back into silence, not out of defiance, but out of profound grief and confusion about their own identities. Everything they had fought for, everything that had given their suffering meaning, had been revealed as a lost cause. Then came the second wave of devastating news. Reports began filtering in about the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The scale of destruction was incomprehensible. Entire cities vaporized in single blasts. Tens of thousands killed instantly, more dying slowly from radiation sickness. Captain Walsh debated whether to share these details with the prisoners, but Lieutenant Chen argued they had a right to know the truth about what had happened to their homeland. When the women learned about the bombs, their reaction was different from the surrender announcement. This was not grief, but horror, mixed with disbelief. Keiko read the newspaper reports that Chen translated, her hands trembling as she processed the impossible numbers. 100,000 dead in Hiroshima, 70,000 in Nagasaki. Cities that had been home to hundreds of thousands of people simply ceased to exist. She thought about Yokohama, so close to these devastated areas. If the Americans possessed weapons of such terrible power, what had they done to her city? Were her parents among the countless casualties? Had her little sister Emiko been vaporized by atomic fire before she even knew what was happening? Yuki, whose family lived in Tokyo, learned that the capital had been subjected to months of intensive firebombing even before the atomic weapons were used. The reports described neighborhoods burning for hours, fire-creating winds so strong they lifted people off their feet and threw them into the flames. The wooden houses that characterized Japanese cities had become kindling for an inferno that killed more people in a single night than many entire battles. She tried to calculate whether her family's neighborhood had been in the affected areas, but the scope of destruction was so vast that such calculations felt meaningless. The women began receiving Red Cross reports about conditions in occupied Japan. The country was starving. Cities lay in ruins. Infrastructure had collapsed. Disease was spreading. American occupation forces were distributing food to prevent mass starvation, but supplies were limited, and the need was overwhelming. The Japan they had known no longer existed. In its place was a devastated, defeated nation struggling to survive under foreign occupation. Several women received official notifications that their families could not be located. The Red Cross could not confirm whether they were dead or simply displaced among the millions of refugees wandering through the ruins. It was Private Costa who noticed that the women had stopped eating again. Not completely, but they were back to consuming only minimal amounts, pushing food around their plates without interest. Sergeant Brooks was frustrated and worried. "We cannot force-feed them," he told Captain Walsh, "but if they keep this up, we will have medical problems." It was Corporal Fletcher who inadvertently sparked the conversation that would change everything. On a warm September afternoon, he brought a box of hot dogs to the women's compound, just as he had done months earlier when trying to break through their silence. But this time, his gesture carried different weight. The women looked at the familiar food with empty eyes, and Fletcher realized that what had once been a bridge between cultures now seemed pointless in the face of their crushing grief about returning to a destroyed homeland. Keiko picked up one of the hot dogs, holding it carefully as memories flooded back. She remembered her first confused bite, thinking she was eating dog meat. She remembered learning the strange English words, laughing quietly with Yuki about how nothing in America made sense. She remembered Fletcher's patient efforts to teach them, Costa's kind smile, Sergeant Brooks's concern when they would not eat. All of these small moments, accumulated over months, had created something she had not expected. They had created the possibility of belonging somewhere other than Japan. That evening, the women gathered in their barracks for a conversation that had been building since the surrender announcement. Harumi, Still, the unofficial leader, despite her own devastation, stood before the group and spoke in Japanese with quiet intensity. "We must discuss our future. Repatriation will begin soon. We must decide if we want to return to Japan." The question hung in the air. Several women immediately insisted they would return, that their duty was to help rebuild their homeland regardless of conditions. But others remained silent, their faces reflecting a different kind of struggle. Yuki spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Return to what? My family is gone. My city is ashes. The Japan I knew does not exist anymore. What am I returning to?" Michiko added her own painful truth. "I received word yesterday. My parents died in the Tokyo firebombing. My brother was killed on Okinawa. I have no one left. I would be going back to a country full of ghosts." Reiko, who had screamed in anguish at the surrender, now spoke with eerie calmness. "We were taught that Americans were demons, but the demons fed us. They taught us their language. They showed us kindness when they could have shown us cruelty. Meanwhile, our own leaders sent us to die for a lie." The conversation grew more intense as women shared their private fears and hopes. Some argued that staying in America would be the ultimate betrayal, that they owed their loyalty to Japan regardless of what had happened. Others countered that Japan had betrayed them first by lying about the nature of the war, about the camps, about everything. The debate continued for hours, voices rising and falling in waves of emotion. Finally, Keiko stood and walked to the small shelf where she kept her few possessions. She picked up the silk pouch containing her family photograph and held it carefully. "I have been thinking about the hot dogs," she said quietly, and several women looked at her with confusion. "When Fletcher first brought them, we thought they were dog meat. We were horrified. We almost refused to eat because we did not understand. We misunderstood because we only knew our own world," Keiko continued, still holding the photograph of her family. "But when we tried to understand, when we tasted something new despite our fear, we discovered it was not what we thought. America is like that hot dog, strange name, confusing at first, but not the enemy we were told it was." She paused, gathering courage for what she needed to say next. "I want to stay in America. I want to understand this place that treated us with more humanity than our own leaders did. If my family survived, I will bring them here someday. If they did not, then I will build a new life that honors their memory by choosing hope over hatred." Her words broke open a dam of suppressed feelings. Within days, 11 of the 43 women had privately approached Captain Walsh, requesting to remain in the United States rather than accept immediate repatriation. The announcement created shockwaves through military channels. Washington officials debated the unprecedented request while the women waited in anxious limbo. Local newspapers picked up the story, with headlines ranging from sympathetic to hostile. Some communities saw the women as symbols of redemption. Others viewed them as dangerous enemy nationals who should be expelled immediately. But support came from unexpected places. The Henderson family, who had befriended several prisoners through church outreach, offered to sponsor Keiko. Dr. Morrison at Florence General Hospital, impressed by Yuki's nursing skills, arranged for her to continue medical training under supervision. Local businesses, remembering how the women had helped during their captivity, stepped forward with job offers and housing assistance. Private Costa's mother, still grieving her nephew's death, but moved by the women's obvious sincerity, offered to help Michiko learn English and American customs. The final decision came in October 1945. The 11 women who wished to stay would be reclassified as displaced persons and processed for potential immigration status. They would no longer be prisoners of war, but they would also no longer have the security of the camp. They would need to make their own way in a country that had recently been their mortal enemy. The 32 women who chose repatriation prepared to leave with mixed emotions, understanding and respecting their friends' decision even if they could not make the same choice themselves. On departure day, the scene was unlike anything Camp Florence had witnessed. American guards and Japanese prisoners who had once faced each other across enemy lines now embraced and exchanged addresses, promising to write. Harumi, who had chosen to return to Japan, held Keiko's hands and spoke in Japanese through her tears. "You are not betraying our homeland. You are building a bridge. Someday, Japan will need people who understand both worlds." The women boarding the transport trucks carried with them letters from American soldiers, photographs from their time at camp, and small gifts, including, from Sergeant Brooks, a carefully wrapped package of hot dogs to eat on their journey. 20 years later, Keiko Tanaka Fletcher stood behind the counter of a small restaurant in Florence, Arizona, serving hot dogs to a line of customers that included both Americans and Japanese tourists. She had married Corporal Thomas Fletcher in 1948, a union that scandalized some but inspired others.